Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Roman Empire in Crisis, 248 to 260, When the Gods Abandoned Rome, by Paul N. Pearson. Narrated by Roger Clark. Introduction. This book is a narrative account of a dozen momentous years in the history of Rome intended for anyone interested in ancient history. The timeline stands alone, but it roughly follows on from my earlier book, Maximinus Thrax, which was published in 2016. As I remarked in the introduction to that book, the 3rd century has a special appeal because it is not part of the corpus of shared learning that has become known as general knowledge. Many people can name a string of famous Romans, soldiers, statesmen, emperors, and even poets, but one can safely bet that none of them would hail from the period discussed herein. That is not because it was an uninteresting or unimportant time, far from it. I hope the listener will agree. Although I am an academic, my intention here is to tell the story for the general listener rather than scholarly research as such. It is therefore mainly a work of synthesis. I have engaged with a wide range of questions that are actively being studied by many specialists. Occasionally I have made what I believe to be proposals that may be worthy of broader consideration by scholars. I have made copious use of footnotes to try to do justice to the wide range of primary and secondary literature, and so that none of my suggestions or inferences stands unsupported. The central organizing principle of the text is the passage of time. I find that describing events in sequence, without too much foresight, is a fine way of imagining what it must have been like to experience them. Decisions that people made are often best understood without the benefit of hindsight. Putting the story together was especially challenging for the final few years of my chosen period, when the precise timing and sequence of events is not firmly established and subject to vigorous debate. I did not want to trouble the listener by presenting too many alternative timelines and scenarios, so I have chosen what I think is the most likely chronology, while signposting where the major uncertainties lie. My justification is that the narrative is itself what scientists call a model, a framework explanation that can be confirmed or refuted when new evidence comes to light. Telling the story of the crisis years is no easy task. Events are fast-moving and intricate, and the historical sources are particularly patchy and challenging to interpret. Because of this, sweeping histories of Rome have tended to skirt over the period in just a few sentences. Fortunately, however, important new information has come to light in recent years. Significant archaeological finds have been made that are directly relevant to the period, foremost of which is the discovery of the great battlefield of Abritus, which I have studied myself. Fundamental new insights have also been gleaned regarding the nature and course of an appalling pestilence that swept the empire. Most amazing, however, is the discovery of substantial new chunks of history which were written down for posterity by Dexippus of Athens, a man who lived through the period. These priceless pages have been meticulously recovered, published, and translated for the first time, the definitive edition appearing in 2020. I applaud everyone in that task for the heroic effort of scholarship involved and the spirit of openness and collaboration that is evident from all the publications. Dexippus's text is still very incomplete, and more may yet be deciphered, but it invites a radical new interpretation of events that have previously defied analysis. Details of all these discoveries, scientific, archaeological, and historiographical, will be provided in due course, but together they make it possible to throw new light on a neglected but important interval of history when classical civilization crumbled and a new world order began to emerge. Prologue. Millennium. The year that we now count as 248 of the Common Era was Rome's millennium. By the standard reckoning, 1,000 years had passed since Romulus had used his plough to mark out the city boundaries on the Palatine Hill. The Romans even claimed to know exactly when the city was founded, 21st of April, 753 BCE. Every year that day was celebrated as Rome's birthday, and also as a festival sacred to Pales, god of livestock, shepherds, and drovers. Or perhaps goddess. The Romans seem to have been undecided on the sex of this particular deity, or even whether there were one or two of them, so ancient was the cult. Romulus was the mortal son of Mars, the god of war, and as every Roman knew, he had been abandoned at birth with his twin brother Remus on the banks of the Tiber. The babies had been discovered by a she-wolf who sustained them with her milk, then by a woodpecker who fed them morsels, and finally by a shepherd who took them in. As adults, the twins decided to establish a settlement, but they argued bitterly about the best location. The dispute became so violent that Romulus killed his brother before founding the city that bears his name. The story would seem to portend a violent and warlike future for Rome, with much internecine struggle. Subsequent generations usually managed to live up to that expectation, and never more so than in the period covered by this book. Amazingly, there may be some vestige of truth in the city's legendary origin. Archaeological discoveries on the Palatine Hill, rudimentary buildings, the remains of a wall, and so on, date back to around the middle of the 8th century BCE, when Romulus is supposed to have lived there. An important riverbank trading center was established around that time, with links across the Mediterranean. The first major milestone in the city's history is of deep significance for understanding the events described in this book. Around 509 BCE, the fledgling city-state had become tired of tyrannical rulers and expelled the last of its kings. An orderly republic was instituted, headed by pairs of supreme magistrates called consuls who were elected annually. It should have been a time of celebration and optimism, but a great plague struck the city, indicating the displeasure of the gods. One of the new consuls, Publius Valerius Publicola, sought to appease them by sacrificing to Proserpine, goddess of fertility. In the winter months, this goddess, who is identified with the Greek Persephone, was confined to the underworld as the part-time enforced wife of Pluto. But she was set free in the spring, bringing new life to the fields and crops. Perhaps Proserpine could bring about spiritual renewal for Rome? The sacrifices worked. The plague ceased, heralding a new springtime and a joyous new age, or saeculum, in which Rome was set to thrive as a free republic with endorsement from on high. At some point it was decreed that the sacrifices should be renewed every 100 years, each time ushering in a new golden age. Rome survived as a republic for almost 500 years, until an effective monarchy was re-established by Octavian, who ruled from 27 BCE and is regarded as the first Roman emperor. Crucially, he did not base his claim to rule on his evident military genius and ruthless suppression of all challengers, but rather on his successful intercession with the gods through his role as highest priest. Octavian was careful to style his autocratic rule as denoting another dawning golden age. The Senate of Rome awarded him the numinous title Augustus, related to the word for religious augury, as a personal name. Hence, he is generally known simply as Augustus. The propaganda of his regime focused relentlessly on the benefits of peace and prosperity that had been brought about through his divine offices, in contrast to the catastrophe of civil war that had preceded it. Every subsequent emperor appended the name Augustus to their own, so it quickly became synonymous with the office. In 48 CE, the Emperor Claudius, a descendant of the first Augustus by aristocratic adoption, celebrated the 800th anniversary of the founding of the city and another new golden age. He held a spectacular event called the Ludi Seculares, or secular games, as the phrase is usually translated. It was styled as the spectacle of a lifetime, because no person then alive would live long enough to see the next such event. A century later, in 148 CE, it was the turn of Antoninus Pius to celebrate 900 years. In the early 3rd century, the theme of cyclical decline and renewal continued to be ingrained in the Roman worldview, especially via the Stoic philosophy. The more gloomy intellectuals were apt to regard their world as having been in long decline and in desperate need of renewal. All manner of ills, from failed harvests and diseases to earthquakes and strange portents, were blamed on the fact that the world was in old age, senectus mundi. The foremost historian of the time, Cassius Dio, had famously declared, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." A new springtime was to be expected, but, as usual, it would require approval from the gods. In 248 CE, the emperor at the millennium was Marcus Julius Philippus, or Philip I, as he is known to history. It is clear from the propaganda that he made a huge effort to celebrate the glory of Rome. 3 days of public holiday were declared, running from the 21st to the 23rd of April. It was the perfect time of year for a street party, with spring well under way, and the dead heat of summer yet to arrive. But far from being secular, in the modern sense of non-religious, the whole event was steeped in the traditions and rituals of Roman religion. The focus was on averting evil by honoring, appeasing, and pleasing the gods through sacred ritual, including solemn sacrifice, spells, and incantation. The ceremonial heart of the city was given a splendid facelift in anticipation. Rome was probably the largest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants, and travelers and officials from every nation would have converged there as well. Of central importance for the millennium were processions and libations organized by the houses of the gods. On the Capitoline Hill, directly opposite the city's ancient nucleus, sat Rome's most sacred site, the sublime and ancient temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter, best and greatest of the gods, a building so opulent that in comparison all else is like earth compared to heaven, it was remarked. Jupiter was worshipped there together with his wife Juno and daughter Minerva, goddess of wisdom. The inauguration of the millennium celebrations would have happened here, with the Emperor Philip officiating in his role as the highest priest of the Roman religion and the greatest builder of bridges, the Pontifex Maximus, between the mortal world and the divine. The sacred way, via Sacra, emerged from the temple precinct and ran steeply down past a complex of forums, the Senate House, and other public buildings, and on to the great Flavian amphitheatre or Colosseum. As the name suggests, this processional route was lined with many other great temples, some of which even hailed from the time when Rome had kings, although they had been rebuilt in ever more splendid style in lockstep with the fortune of the city. It is now an archaeological park in the center of Rome, visited by millions each year. Let us discuss some of these establishments, which are now mostly reduced to their foundations and wall lines, and instead imagine them smothered in gaudy paintwork and sparkling with gold leaf and burnished bronze statues. At the foot of the Capitoline Hill is the Temple of Concord, representing social harmony, which doubles as something of an art gallery, and that of Saturn, god of wealth and celebration, which also houses the state treasury. Next is the Temple of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, protector of the state, and home to an eternal flame tended by the revered Vestal virgins, who live in demure opulence in an adjacent palace, and that of Janus, the god of time and new beginnings. Janus has two faces, one looking back and the other forward, which is especially relevant on this occasion. Then there is the temple of Castor and Pollux, the youthful twin sons of Jupiter, who, it is said, were glimpsed in ancient times in the din of battle at the head of a Roman army. More recent additions along the route include the magnificent temple of Mars, the Avenger, guarantor of military victories, dedicated by the first Augustus himself, and various other houses sacred to the imperial cult. All of these were sending up fogs of incense and prayers. But the special focus for this particular occasion, and the likely culmination of the three-day event, was the combined temple of Rome and Venus, which stood on a huge gleaming marble platform between the Forum and Colosseum. Most cities, towns, and even villages of the empire had their home gods and shrines, but there was nothing anywhere to match Rome's brash monument to itself. Rome was the eternal city, victorious in war and mistress of the world. A giant cult statue of Roma was seated within the enormous colonnades, the general effect being somewhat like the modern Lincoln Memorial in Washington, and on which architectural tradition that monument was based. But unlike Lincoln, Roma was dressed for war, holding spear and shield, and in her right palm sat the winged figure of victory. This building was designed by no less a person than the Emperor Hadrian, who fancied himself as a refined man of culture. Not everyone liked it, however. A condescending architect at the time joked that the statue was so large that, had she stood up, she would have bumped her head, a remark that cost him his life. As with other ancient festivals, there would have been a vibrant fringe, with theatrical events and literary readings across the city, and entertainment of all levels of sophistication. Most popular would have been chariot racing at the Circus Maximus, a racecourse that could seat no fewer than 300,000 people, and which has been claimed as the largest building ever made for entertainment purposes. Here the traditional teams, red, white, blue, and green, competed for lavish prizes and glory, mostly in the four-horse rig. It was the city's sporting obsession. A visitor remarked that the populace wear themselves out from dawn to dusk, wet or fine, in detailed discussion of the merits and demerits of horses and their drivers. Another focus of the Millennium Party was a huge concrete reservoir specially constructed on the far bank of the Tiber and designed for staging naval battles. Teams of gladiators took each other on in deadly entertainment. When the festivities came to an end, the reservoir was used to supply clean water to a large area that had previously suffered from shortages. There is something quintessentially Roman about combining the requirements of a lavish and brutal public spectacle with a pragmatic engineering solution to an everyday problem. And, of course, there were gladiatorial bouts at the Colosseum, the great gleaming oval amphitheater that still dominates the city, named after a colossal statue that once stood beside it. These events were also considered sacred, with the ritual fighting dedicated to the gods. The acts in the arena, the Latin word for sand, used to soak up the blood. At the millennium included, according to an admittedly dubious source, no fewer than 1,000 gladiatorial pairings, which would equate to 30 bouts per hour of daylight throughout the festivities, if evenly spread out. The following animals are also mentioned: 32 elephants, 10 elks, 10 tigers, 60 tame lions, presumably for tricks, and 10 wild ones for fighting, 30 leopards, 10 hyenas, 6 hippopotami, 1 rhinoceros, 10 giraffes, 20 wild asses, 40 wild horses, and various other animals of this nature without number. Some of these unfortunate beasts were provoked into fighting one another in strange groupings, while others were ritually hunted by highly skilled gladiators using lances or arrows. Events were carefully choreographed in the enormous venue with its many underground passages, elevator cages, trapdoors, and other cunning artifices. Anyone who has lived near a sports stadium will know the enthralling sound of a crowd when heard from the empty streets outside. Nowadays it is difficult to imagine any great city without constant traffic noise, Rome especially. But in ancient times the surging roar of 60 or 70,000 spectators when a gladiator met a gruesome end must have reverberated back across the famous 7 hills, adding to the communal sense of occasion. In the evenings one can imagine great flame-lit barbecues in the city's open spaces, all at the imperial expense, in which the crowds feasted on the exotic animals of the arena, as well as the many beasts sacrificed in the temples to propitiate the gods and pray for good fortune in the dawning age. To mark the event, a beautiful and highly distinctive coinage was issued in huge quantities by the great city mint, bearing the legend Secularis Aug, epochs of the 2 emperors. The second emperor was Philip's young son, known as Philip II, who was then only about 12 or 13 years old, but had nevertheless been given the exalted title of Augustus the year before. There were 6 departments, or officinae, in the mint, and there were 6 main designs. Uniquely in the whole series of Roman coinage, the departments identified themselves numerically, which looks like a conscious attempt to add to the commemorative value and even collectability of these pieces. On the tail sides, 5 of the 6 designs show animals to be sacrificed in the arena. Number 1 is a lion, advancing menacingly to the right and evidently mid-roar. Number 3 is a goat, in a more peaceful posture. Number 4, it was written like I, not IV, is a hippopotamus. Number 5 is a stag with magnificent horns and a shaggy coat. And number 6 is a graceful antelope. The odd one out, design 2, shows the she-wolf suckling the twins Romulus and Remus. Departments 1, 2, 5, and 6 issued coins in the name of the senior emperor Philip I. Department 3 was allocated to his son. Department 4 was for Philip's wife, the Augusta Empress, whose name was Marcia Ottacilia Severa. The leading lady is shown with intricately plaited hair, as was fashionable in that era. It seems she did not object to being uniquely associated with the hippopotamus. Such coins make very charming artworks, partly because the dies wore out, so many variants had to be made. Modern specialists estimate that each die was used tens of thousands of times before being discarded, but even so it is uncommon to find 2 coins struck from the same template. indicating that millions of each type must have been minted. After the event, another new coinage was issued showing the Temple of Roma with the legend Saculum Novum, a new age. Another shows Roma herself holding the figure of victory with the legend Romae Aeternae, eternal Rome. The public celebrations were not limited to sports and fighting. Poets, artists, writers, and philosophers were also involved, competing for prizes and fame. Many of these would have used the occasion to showcase their public speaking skills by praising the emperor or elaborating on the amazing story of the city, which in 1,000 years had grown from a few huts on the Palatine to the greatest metropolis on the planet. Indeed, the span of 1,000 years was of great significance to historians in particular. It so happens that the legendary foundation of Rome, 753 BCE, came just a little after the first Olympiad in Greece, 776 BCE, and the appointment of the first named Athenian archons, chief magistrates, with time-limited powers, 764 or 753 BCE. The archives of these institutions permitted research among the scrolls and the development of a fairly sound chronology. The historian Asinius Quadratus, probably writing during the celebrations, entitled his sadly lost history of the civilized world Millennium. The span of 1,000 years may also have been used by the great Dexippus of Athens for his own historical chronicle written some decades later. This historical age contrasted with the dim and distant time before 1,000 years passed, which was considered the proper domain of poets like Homer and Virgil. And history has few more astonishing trajectories than the rise of Rome. The settlement, supposedly founded by Romulus, had started by subduing and dominating its Latin neighbors, town by town, and gradually its influence had expanded across much of what is now central Italy. The Greek-speaking colonies of the Italian peninsula were conquered, bringing new wealth and opportunities to what was, by that time, a nascent empire. The first overseas province, Provincia, was established on what is now the southern coast of France, in an area still called Provence, followed by the conquest of Sicily and Carthage in a most brutal series of wars that made Rome the undisputed regional superpower. Greece and Spain, Egypt, Asia Minor and the Levant, Gaul, most of Britain, Thrace, roughly Bulgaria, Dacia, roughly Romania, all followed, so that the entire Mediterranean became fringed by Roman territory and came to be known as Mare Nostrum, our sea. A state of peace usually prevailed over Rome's dominions where before there had been a morass of warring tribes and city-states. This circumstance allowed for massive economic integration and technological development. The great city at the hub of all the infrastructure constantly reminded the world that it had brought peace, Pax Romana, to the world, albeit at sword point. And to many it must have seemed that Rome was indeed destined to endure for eternity, as the propaganda claimed. But swaggering confidence in the city and its empire was not universally held. As befits the gloom of the Stoics, then in their ascendancy, there were also nervous murmurings and predictions of some imminent and calamitous change in the world order. We now know, with the full benefit of hindsight, that the emperor was about to tumble into a period of extreme crisis, indeed the most extraordinary phase of its history. The strife would be military, but it was also political, economic, social, and even spiritual. In the great struggle that lay ahead there would be winners and losers. Few could have predicted it during the millennium celebrations, but the days of the eternal gods themselves were numbered. 100 years on, there was to be no repeat of the secular games.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?